is my great pleasure, on behalf of FutureEverything, to welcome Ben to the festival. Ben really is a conceptual strategist, and it's a beautiful world and realm to be in. Somebody who works a lot on fusing digital applications with the real world, and perhaps bringing the real world into digital applications. He's, among other things, one of the key members or advisors for the San Francisco-based firm Stammen. And he's also founder and director of something which I'm not quite so clear about myself, but he's probably going to tell us a bit more about Verb. I just asked him what Verb stands for, V-U-R-B. But it's really meant not really as an acronym, but about a way in which we can understand the city as an active verb. So Ben, welcome to Manchester, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I am just about to sort of launch into what in some ways is almost a sermon from coming from my sort of conceptual strategic space, which is to say that I have kind of a rant that's a very lyrical take on what cities might be doing in the future and how we might be participating in that. But I wanted to start briefly with a little bit of context. We had just to sort of set the stage from where I'm coming from, probably the most critical sort of pivotal moment in my digital design experience was in the crafting of something called the game Neverending, which ultimately became Flickr. And that was probably the way in which we were looking at online collaborative creativity as a game to begin with, which then sort of distilled itself into a social network that had a very playful character, was actually the type of movement that sort of allowed me to understand the possibilities of how sort of dynamic, playful interaction can really be transformative to culture overall, rather than just as kind of a game mechanic that's kind of marginal to the way that society is operating. I also was the director of something at Frog Design called the Experience Design Laboratory, which sort of comes in critically here. Frog Design is an industrial design agency that works with Fortune 500 companies, design, products and services and environments. The lab that I ran was about specifically studying the convergence of hardware and software into unified systems for experience. So the idea was that, previously Frog Design had multiple separate practices that were looking at independent pursuits, different trajectories into the design process. This was about sort of bringing them back around again to understand the interdependencies and sort of begin to realize that there was a sort of a coherent way that you might want to describe sort of, again, the conceptual model that surrounds the whole endeavor of design in a context like that of industrial design. And then Stammen, which we were just discussing in the opening remarks, is a data visualization agency based in San Francisco. And what we look at are huge data sets that are live and vast and deep, that are coming at us from things like instrumented cities, which I'll be talking about in a little bit, but also from social networks, from government archives, from historical data sets, all of these things that are, huge and sort of previously imperceivable before we evolved technologies that allowed us to aggregate that information, to model it, to process it, and then to visualize it in ways that we could sort of begin to understand the patterns in. And so Stammen is very much an exercise in sort of building kind of cybernetic organs for perception. How do we build things that allow us to see what we could not see before using computation? So the final thing that this is probably most related to is a foundation that I run in Amsterdam called Verb, which is about research and development around the ideas of urban scale computational infrastructure. What does it mean as the city becomes computational? How do information technologies and network technologies begin to transform everyday life in the city? Because it's sort of already a locus, a nexus for infrastructural development. What does the addition of the layer of computation have to do with that? And this sort of essay that I'm about to launch on is sort of a investigation into one of the sort of models for how that might be happening. So in order to sort of talk about the future of cities, of course, it's always interesting to look at a trajectory of where they've come from and really what are they. And that's really it's semantics is always like this. You sort of start off with a very sort of affable confidence in a word when you first say it. Oh, it's a city, whatever, and then you're like, well, what does that mean? It's like the city could be a lot of different things. One of the things that it obviously is a materialization of culture. It is a record, a physical record of society, and that that already is just totally interesting from the idea that we right now we're very obsessed with the idea of data as history, but the history is already obviously written in stone that we've organized ourselves over thousands of years. And so the city has a past, and we live inside that past, and that actually shapes our psychology, and we have a relationship with the city based on that psychology. The other thing that's really interesting about the city is that it actually is generated by organizational patterns that have no physical, that they project into physical reality only in the built environment. But there are rules that are, codes that are then, taken by different civic agencies and turned into the city. But the city, its process involves a relationship between the intangible, which is an organizational system, which is society itself, and the tangible, which is the built environment. Of course, the city, in its most practical sense, and from a human perspective, what the ideal of the city is the optimization of sort of cohabitation. The sort of utopian vision of the city is that we're going to build something that allows people to live together in the most harmonious way possible. Now, this is obviously, as with all utopia, sort of an unattainable goal, but it's actually a pole star to sort of structure how we're thinking about the advancement of urban development. So what would the platform for optimum cohabitation look like? And is there even a way for us to arrive at an answer for that satisfies everyone's desires? And probably from a geological perspective, sort of a perspective of the rhythm of the city over hundreds of years, the city is constantly being refreshed. The city is being rebuilt, reused, and destroyed over and over again. It has a sort of almost a heartbeat of development. I mean, we've seen almost a heart attack of development in the last 10 years in terms of a sudden pulse and then silence in terms of how the built environment was treated, and so that's kind of how it organizationally operates. But what's the actual material? What are the ingredients of the city? What is it that we're organizing? And even that is sort of in question because there are a lot of different frames of analysis that you can apply in that case. Probably the most sort of abstract in terms of like almost the physics of the city is that there is matter, there is energy, and there's information. And all of those things are flowing around and sort of being knotted together organizationally into these huge constructs at a massive scale. But the thing that's kind of interesting about this is that you could also describe the body using these same ingredients. And so there's it's something very interesting about how complexity is expressed almost anywhere in the universe. These three ingredients are almost always there. And so, the city, in that regard is something that's operating on a different valence of complexity, but in a very similar manner to something like the body. Probably in terms of our own lived experience of the city, what we're dealing with are infrastructure, people, and organizations. That's really what the city means to us. We have various modes of interaction with other people, various modes of interaction with infrastructure, various modes of interaction with organizations in the city, and that's kind of, those three actions pretty much comprise what we do in relation to the city. And then probably in terms of the discourse of futurism about the city, we've entered in this age, I've been talking about it for a long time. I think now everyone is, talking about it, the city as platform. And when they say platform, what they're implying is a computational platform. And so, you can look at the computational platform as made up of these ingredients. And they kind of correspond to some of the ingredients that we were just talking about. There's sort of matter, energy, and information, or people, infrastructure, and organizations. Those things can kind of layer in terms of the metaphoric combination of ingredients that we're looking at. So what happened, what was the moment the city was born? And, one of the things that's really interesting about the moment the city was born is that we have a word for that moment, and it's called civilization. The word civil is obviously the city, and civilization was pretty much the abstraction of organization. The tribe, previously, the tribe had a village, and you could pretty much contain the idea of the village in your head. There were a bunch of people in the village, you kind of knew what they all did, you knew where they lived. It was a map that you could internalize, and it was something that you were sort of like, it was part of, it could be part of your unconscious almost. You didn't really have to maintain an abstract understanding of what the village was. It's sort of like saying, where's my hand? Well, where's where's Auntie's house or whatever? It's just right over there. Whereas in the city, it's totally different. The city is all about these, intensifications of task, the sort of buildings that are built specifically for organizations like the church or the state. These things are a level of abstraction above what people were dealing with before the city arrived. And so the city, in a way, was the first vessel of abstract organization. And in a way, it was the first vessel of programming. So it is actually, the city is a platform already before computers arrive, because it is dealing with the idea of program. And that program is called the law. That is actually what civil society is the program for the city. It's how the people live together. There's sort of the hardware of the city, which is the built environment, and there's the software, which is the law or the civil environment or the state, I guess some people would call it, capital S. And so the city and the state pretty much born together at the same time. The state was actually that abstraction of organization that made the city possible. So once you have the state, then you have not just a set of rules of how to live in the city, but a set of rules to how to generate the city. And that means that it's not just like, I'm just gonna put a house right here. You don't, like in the village, maybe you grew up, you moved out of the generational house, and you went down the road and said, here's the first site where the woods are nice and filled with deer, and I can plant my maize, and excellent, here's my house. That's not the way it worked in the city, because the city had this whole, canonical set of interrelationships that said, you cannot build here because it's zoned in this way, or you cannot build here because there's this idea of property. All of these things have, arose out of the law, and they made a process for the unfolding of the city. And again, that is something that you can sort of, use that as a way to get back to the body again, because it's also what we call procedural morphogenesis. It's the idea that shape takes place due to program. And so the city had a program. The city, obeys a program in the way that it manifests itself. Sometimes the program is good, sometimes it's not so good, but there are rules. So, these rules, of course, have gone through an evolution over time. And, early on, the rules, there was the idea of civilization was that it got, progressively more formal toward the articulation of absolute monarchy, basically. That was the first phase of the city, was that, the Sun King in Versailles was able to articulate a unified vision for the built environment. There was one place where he sat, and the entire built environment revolved around that place. And that, from an organizational perspective and a sort of a polarization of power, a crystallization of power into infrastructure, that was probably one of the ultimate expressions of that. You find, in other imperial architectures, Mayan architecture, various other architectures, you also find this style of, encapsulation of power in place. But now, partially because of, the forces of capitalism and the forces of globalization and various other things. It's a multipolar space in the city. There are a lot of competing frames of reference. There are a lot of competing kind of interests that define kind of the field effects that provide the organizing principles for the city. And so, what we're seeing is this granular erosion of what was once this, absolute kind of projection into space of one story is now becoming, multiplicity of stories. And that's part of the reason why that happened is because of the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution, was a discontinuity in human civilization. It just changed everything in a huge way. And it changed the city probably most of all, because the city became a whole bunch of things that it wasn't before. Basically, the city itself became an engine. The idea was that, these things that we called the organizational procedural rule sets that were organizing the city, those things were abstracted even further to say that they can't just make a city, they can make anything. Basically, if you can achieve scale with organizational sort of process and flow, you can do whatever the hell you want. You can build things that reach the sky. You can build things that take you across town in a quarter of the time that it once took to ride your horse. You can, talk into a box and someone else hears you elsewhere. This was like magic. All of this stuff was magic, and all of it was because, there was this mastery over organizational forces, and part of the reason why those forces could be mastered is because they were already systematized in the city. So, you had things like the city became legible to itself. There was already data visualization built into the city by the skyline. That's what industrialization gave to us in terms of our own ability to recognize kind of the lay of the city from a distance or from any point in the city. You could always orient yourself by where the tall buildings were. What part of town is this? Because you can sort of tell whether it's going to be, big commercial, little commercial, residential. There's like basically an equalizer of demographics that's sort of, being played out on the skyline in some, very slow refresh rate. And of course, the idea of networks and the physicalization of networks. Networks had always been there. There'd always been, ever since there were cow paths before the city was even there were obviously like sort of preferred routes that people took, but sort of the institutionalization and the physicalization of those networks was a type of optimization that allowed the city to, be that much more adaptive and that much more providing of these incredibly complex networks of resources, whether they were people to a job on some mass transit, whether they were, material flow on the train moving around the town, whether they were instructions or market indicators that were going back and forth over the telegraph or telephone. All of those things were, churning and sort of accelerating the city almost out of control. For a while, there were these mass explosions of population. There was things went haywire, and so there was a little bit of a dying down again of enthusiasm about the city. But now we're at another discontinuity. It turns out, we had this kind of crazy, hockey stick, as the statisticians like to say, especially the ones talking about business plans, up and to the right that industrialization provided for the city, and now we're at another inflection point where information technology is providing that same type of crazy acceleration to what the city can do. And there are a couple of things that are different about it. One of the things that's different is that, where industrialization was mostly about the idea that you were building rail lines or buildings or, stringing wires, this is actually much more about the idea of the amplification of those organizational processes that produced the city and industrialization in the first place. This is about the idea of the software. This is about how do we work with the actual data that is the city. The city expresses data, and the city can be built out of data. And so, the more we begin to understand, before we kind of always knew that in the sense that we had plans about the city and we had statistics about the city and we had jobs that were, analysts about the city, but we didn't have ways of looking in real time at the enormous amounts of data the city generates, and we didn't have ways of writing things into the city through actuation and through dynamic systems of, adaptive physical systems. So, most of what's really interesting about how we as individuals living in the city are going to relate to this revolution is actually a surface that we can, it's a surface that we can touch. It's a set of interactions. The city is kind of coming to a bigger infrastructure in the city, very complex systems in the city are sort of coming towards us into things that we can see and hold and touch. They're actually handles on the city, handles on processes in the city that we didn't even really understand before. They're now sort of coming into our hands and becoming available to us as handles on how we can change it. So, rather than the skyline, which before was this incredibly, if you were to say, what is the iconic production of industrialization, it was the skyline. That's how you knew the city because you could always draw one little line that represented which city you were talking about. If it had the Eiffel Tower in it, you knew. If it had the Opera House in it, you knew. And now it turns out that when you want to find out what the essence of a city is, you might just log into Flickr and type, San Francisco. And that's actually, rather than saying, here's the skyline, here's a huge deluge of information from, everywhere online, tons and tons of information. There are public data sets that are coming from the city itself. There's Wikipedia, there's, Vimeo, who knows? There's just a bazillion things that are all tagged with San Francisco. And so there's this incredible cloud of information around the city that's not just the physical city, but its digital representation. So, part of what this whole process is about, this oncoming revolution is sort of the understanding of how data gets moved back and forth between this cloud and the physical city itself. And part of it is about, this infrastructure of sensation and the infrastructure of people reporting their location and reporting their mood about where they are and, reporting what the traffic is like. And part of it is about, building an infrastructure that's responsive to that. How does the city actually become active and dynamic in a way that these network services can change the city in real time? The idea that, that we will be empowered to actually write our desires back into the city in real time seems still a little bit fantastical, but there's already certain things that are, available to us that kind of point the way to that. There are already in New York City, there's a little service that allows you to summon a cab with the press of one button. It knows where your location is, so you just hit the button that says cab, and the cab shows up. There are things like OpenTable that get you reservations at a restaurant nearby with just pressing a button. There are things that allow you to vote in city councils about what it is that you want to, how you want the next round of development in your neighborhood to go based on looking at an online model and collaboratively, sort of tweaking that and sending it back and forth as sort of a conversational object about what is the future of your neighborhood going to be like. And you can participate in that conversation in ways that you couldn't before, and you can do it at this really high refresh rate. So there are a lot of the aspects of the city that are becoming fluid under the influence of network technology. That there's this realization, you have sensors that are building a model of the city for you, and as you begin to understand how this model is interconnected, you can then begin to build systems that poke at very specific parts of the city in ways that activate whole networks, because you have this understanding of the interdependencies of the forces that make the city do what it does. And so, you can then identify, much smaller movements, much smaller actuations that actually affect the city in certain ways, closing one lane of traffic on a bridge and opening up the lane of traffic in the other direction. Things like traffic management particularly has been incredibly affected by sensors in the roadway. And that right now is managed by a central, office a lot of the times. In San Francisco, certainly the way that the bridge lanes are delegated is still, somebody drives up and down the road with a set of cones and lays them down and takes them up again so that people are driving. The traffic flow is balanced, but those models are becoming sort of refreshed in real time in ways that the city could actually begin to respond itself to those inbound stimuli. So what we're looking at is really a new medium. I mean, it's actually the city. We've had all these other media that. We used to call them desktop media back when there was a desktop, but there sort of isn't that anymore, but which is what I'm about to get to next. And you have, sort of access to computational and digital tools that allow you to re-describe it while you're there. So we have, more ingredients. These are the ingredients of what this, how this revolution is sort of coming together. And all of these pieces of infrastructure are already in play to a certain extent, and they're sort of going through iterative resolution. They're kind of building out, and people are also, at the same time that the actual infrastructure is arriving, people's literacy in how to use it is also arriving. And that's the thing that I think is going to be most profound, is sort of to see how people begin to take for granted ways in which they have influence over their environment. In the same way that, people now already, people that have used GPS in their car since they started driving, if the GPS goes down, they're in trouble. Because they've internalized the model of how that works. That's just the way cars are. They have intelligence about where they are. And cities will also have that intelligence built into them, and people will begin to expect that. And that's going to be, I think, a really interesting, sort of moment to go across. So what is the metaphor that I'm proposing to look at how we're going to relate to the way that the city provides all of these affordances to us? How do we actually have handles on this kind of manipulation of the urban environment? And I think that probably the best way to characterize our new computational relationship with things more than just the city, frankly. I think that the way that we're going to be doing computing in the future is not using computers, but I would say using these things that I would call instruments. And instruments is kind of an open word, and that's kind of on purpose, because there are a lot of different things that instruments can be. But fundamentally, I would say that they're pieces of digital hardware, that are invested with network services that can, access different capabilities in the environment. Controller death. Oh, there we go. It's gonna freak out a little bit. Instruments, sort of fundamental definition, this is sort of a dictionary definition of instruments. They're tools that extend human capacities for perception and expression. And that's kind of an interesting thing, right? Because an instrument actually functions in both of those roles of the sensation and the actuation that you might be doing in the environment. So the idea that you're using an instrument to look at the environment is actually not any different at all than the people that first coined the term instrument in the scientific context. People that use microscopes, people that use telescopes. Now what we use are scopes that look at dynamic emergent complexity. We look at patterns that arise in the function of the city and begin to understand what they mean on a totally different scale, in space and time. And these tools we have them already. I mean, they're in our pockets, and they're in our living rooms and things like that. So the idea that quantification is actually also a really interesting, new way that we have learned to relate to the world. I think part of the digital, one of the things that's interesting about the digital is it always has measurement. It always has metrics. I mean, that's what the digital means. I mean, there is actually a quantity of something there. And so what that means is you always have to take something that may have been, kind of unmeasurable before, like values of, how there's a Dutch word, gezelligheid, or gezellig, which means coziness, right? And so coziness is a very abstract word. You can't even really translate it into English, that word. And there is no real quantification for that. And yet, using these systems, you have to quantify because they're digital systems, and so they're looking for a value. And so, the city in some ways becomes digital because it's looked at in a digital way. If you start using digital instruments to look at a city, the city becomes digital because you've applied views that project metrics onto the city that weren't there before. So in the same way that industrialization may have made all buildings to the same gauge, all rail to the same gauge, girders are always the same width or whatever, because you need to have infrastructure that fits together. The city now also has values in terms of the way it's perceived that make it fit together. So the model of the city quantizes the city in a certain way, and we begin to think about it in a very specific way. And of course, the flip side of instrumentation, when you talk about instruments of science and instruments of art, of course, are about expression. And so, there are a lot of things that go with the idea of instrumental expression, and one of them is virtuosity. And I think the real interesting thing about virtuosity is that we have virtuosity with our modern instruments, right? There is enough complexity in the devices that we have at our disposal now that there's a huge difference between somebody who is just playing with one for the first time and somebody who is a virtuoso on that device. There is definitely a skill that has a natural ramp towards expert usage. And that expert usage can be quite expressive. The way in which this device can result in controlling sound in the room already. If you're running some server that has iTunes remote hooked up to it and it's got AirTunes speakers in the room, you could be pulling out your device and changing all sorts of characteristics of what your day-to-day experience is. But things like the AirTunes remote speakers are just the first step in the types of environmental services that are going to be exposed to applications that run on your mobile device. So the idea that you're going to be able to have handles on the way that the city works, just by using something that comes out of your pocket or something that lives on your wrist or is on a necklace or who knows where it's living, but it's a little token that is provisioned with the network that actually can make change in the environment. So, part of what this is about is, a feedback loop that allows people to understand what they might want to activate in the city. So this is actually kind of an abstract photo, but this is a dynamic facade on a piece of architecture that these are all individually articulated, rotatable panels, and so those panels can actually, make waves across the surface of the building or all open up to let more air in. And it's a dynamic feedback loop again. Sometimes, it's almost more like you're tending a process than you're actually willfully activating it, in the sense that this building can actually be smart enough to know whether it's too hot or not inside, and so just open up those vents on its own in almost like an animal reaction to being overheated. And you can just say, I want you to behave like that or not. So you don't even have to say, it's like once removed, you're actually sort of tending a process that already has a stimuli response loop in it, and you're just gardening it. You're saying, okay, well, I kind of want the city to be well-behaved today, or I want it to be extreme today, or I want it to be, it's actually more abstract than just saying, open window, click, click, click. It's sort of saying, here is a set of behaviors that are built into the environment, and I'm going to influence those behaviors, through sort of a secondary language or set of vocabularies. So all of this, of course, is happening in the context of, people's awareness that they're inhabiting a model as well as inhabiting the city. The idea that people have become comfortable with, living inside of Facebook, living inside of World of Warcraft, living inside of spaces that don't exist. So why would they not want to take the same tools that they become comfortable with in Facebook and World of Warcraft, namely things like little displays that tell them how their friends are doing or where they are, or little sort of alerts that are coming from objects that want to talk to them, all of those types of services, are going to be, people have gone native in those environments, and now they're coming back as expats to the real world. And so they have metaphors that they're expecting from the real world. And one of them is this idea that there is a data model that interconnects the relationship between things that they can interrogate and they can investigate and they can actuate. And so all of that is something that people will be literate in going in. It's not like okay, we have to learn about how the city can be dynamic now. It's like they've been in the dynamic city already. It just doesn't exist. So as it begins to exist, they're ready for it. There we go. So yeah, the idea that, for instance, one of the things that I think is going to be really kind of a strange issue to start figuring out is how provisioning of services work in public space, right? Like, if you're somebody who really likes, dubstep or whatever, and you're in a huge public square that has a public speaker system, how do you get to decide that you're going to just, scare the shit out of someone else who's in the same public square, by hitting your dubstep button and destroying them? And so that issue is one that's going to be really, I think, important to try and work out. How do you provision things? And this is something where, the public space becomes, code and law are starting to become the same thing because of ubiquitous computing. We have laws about how provisioning can work. You can play your boombox in the square from this hour to this hour. After that, you're in trouble. And then we have code, which is, this object has permissions to be accessed by this type of user at this time. That is like more than law because it's an actual handle that either is turned on or off. So that's kind of a really scary threshold, and that's actually a moment that we all have to be very aware of, is that part of what's going to be happening in this idea that there's a model that lives on top of the city is this idea of provisioning, which is even more than surveillance, which is kind of the paranoia that most people have about, sort of ubiquitous computing right now. Provisioning is even scarier. You walk up, you're like, you hit your I want a cab button, nothing happens. So you're just standing on a street corner, and you might be there for a long time, or your GPS stops working, and there are no signs on the street anymore because no one uses them anymore because they all have, navigational systems, and if yours is gone, you're screwed. So, that sort of thing is really another aspect of what's oncoming in this sort of age. But one of the things that will be, sort of powerful about the ability of people to, affect the environment is that they'll be able to do so together. Already again, another metaphor that comes from the online world already is this idea of partying up, right? And we do that, Foursquare and some of these like social technologies about approaching the city already kind of get to this point. They haven't actually gone over that threshold yet where you form a party, but you kind of do when you go out on the town. There's like, 4 or 5 of you, and you're gonna go to a club, a restaurant, whatever. And so the idea that you would somehow focus your awareness of each other and your ability to affect the environment as a team. Maybe if you all arrive at the club and you do like dubstep and they're playing some horrible, whatever, Candy Trance or who knows what it is, you get to change the DJ or whatever because you have some capability that you haven't spent yet. But what this really means is that cities are a medium for collaborative performance. The idea that the city is activatable in this way, that we understand the city in a new way, that we participate in networked kind of collaboration around interaction with the city, that there is this model that we can access and that we can write to, and then it writes back into the city. All of these things are kind of the mechanisms by which the city becomes dynamic and fluid around our desires. So it becomes almost like, magnetic material or iron filings that are animated by the magnetism of our desires as we move through the city collectively. So there's kind of this shimmering, rippling kind of reconfiguration of things. As people pass through, having expressed what they want from space, space will begin to be able to give it to them. So, I guess I would say from the history of technology perspective, we've come from what we used to call social computing to social objects. For a while there was this whole talk of blobjects and spimes and things like that, these things that were tweeting and bleeping and interacting with you on the network. And now we're on to social environments. That seems to be really what people are trying to understand. And the thing that's interesting about the idea of social environments is that you could have described a city as that way before computation. So the idea that, yes, this is a social environment. This is one of those things where I think technologists sometimes run out, waving their sort of techno-utopia will change everything flag, and there are a lot of humanists that are standing around like, what? Yes, we've known this for a long time. Social environments, this is where we live, these are the issues. We now have a new sort of mechanism to express the relationships and kind of the affordances of the social environment, but it's the city has always been and will always be a social environment. That's actually the core of what it is. And so the idea that computation has arrived at the idea that it's providing social environments means that it's just technology. Computation is the city. It's all becoming one thing. It's an expression of a complex set of interrelationships that humans inhabit. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Ben, just stay up. We've got possibility for some questions, commentary, feedback. Is there Anybody who would like to jump right in there? You, sir, do we have a microphone for? Yeah, please just come on up here.
So I came a little late, but a great talk. Is there a risk of, and I think this is just a way of trying to get this phrasing, like a hipster hegemony, where they basically a lot of people with kind of the ability to own iPhones and essentially almost have like a fleeting interaction with an element. But I thought it was fascinating what you're talking about. It's basically influencing the music, but if you put that in a slightly kind of wider scale, about influencing the type of products and services, and sort of like Williamsburg, and everything looks the same in a way. And it's because of, if they can almost do this on the way in and out, there's no deep connection or kind of local flavour. So I just wanted
No, I think it's a huge risk, but I would say that, globalization is obviously way ahead of personal technology in causing that monoculture. And so I think in a way, the possibility for tribalism, inside of the monoculture actually is a little bit of differentiation maybe. But I do agree that, there is definitely this, that's always the issue in developing new technologies, is there's always asymmetry in the haves and the have-nots. That's part of what makes technology always a capital driver, because it's something that only a few people are going to get to have, and only the people that spend a lot of money on it. The iPhone is my example, and that's obviously, a hugely elite device, and I think part of it is that's actually, something that cities also, though, have always had is a sort of strata of demographics. You always had, there's always, whatever the fanciest neighborhood, the Kensingtons and the Pacific Heights of the world, and those places may be the places that are enabled, or maybe they're not. Maybe it is it's probably the hipsters that are going to be the people, wielding all of these, environmentally changing devices. And maybe that will make an echo chamber for them, but they're just already there. It's like, you say like, won't these devices make Williamsburg all the same? It's like, no, because it is already. So, but at the same time, it's it is a feedback loop. Obviously, you can there certainly in online communities, you definitely have this feeling that it's like you go onto Reddit or something like that, and you're like, wait a minute, these people have said the same thing to each other for like 100 years or something like that, except for only over the course of 3, But and so you sort of wonder, how will that work out? But part of it is that, physical space is not, online communities can be echo chambers because they don't overlap with other echo chambers. But in physical space, especially in the city, that's part of the beauty of the city, is that it is an amalgam, and so even these people that are bringing their own influences into space, there's synthesis that's not going to be just little bubbles. I think there'll be overlapping tribes. I hope, at least.
Anybody else? Out there? Yep. Mushan, come up to the mic, please. Bring your device.
I dropped my hipster device. You're talking about playing the city, and it's true that there's more opportunity for serendipity in the city because we have to walk from one point to the other. We can teleport like on the web. But on the other hand, it's also true that we can teleport like on the web, which means that in some cases the city is playing us, and the way that capital and spectacle, organizational, city planning kind of thing works, in a lot of cases I feel like in the sense of let's see how this building reacts to us, it's kind of the building is not really listening to us. The building is playing us.
Yeah, well, I would say, not even forget about the technologies of buildings and how they might play us. Is like, think about the two technologies I talked about being projected into space as the models that people understand the dynamic city in. One of which is Facebook, and the other is WoW. And talk about fully enclosed environments. That the society of the spectacle and the built environment has nothing on those things. And so the idea that you're going to be inhabiting this space that is an enclosure, potentially, is something that we have to be very conscious of. I think that's part of the reason why, a lot of, myself and a lot of the other people at the conference are talking about, open data and the idea that the platform is actually a public system managed by the city itself rather than some sort of, capital endeavor. But that's actually a policy. That's actually a policy situation that you have to be able to explain what's going to happen in order to be able to even articulate why the city should care.
As someone who's been looking a lot of on these things, do you have examples where people are actually resisting this kind of top-down, the city would play kind of thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely the idea that there are, like urban media facades are going in all over the place, and a lot of times there's, contestation over who gets to access that, and so a lot of times there are these things where it's supposed to go in for public art, and then somehow, lo and behold, advertisers are on the thing, and then people hack it back to being, something that's for art, and so there's this kind of, frontiers or thresholds of, of provisioning, of these public systems that people, sort of, go back and forth between hackers and advertisers.
Yeah. Yep, here in front.
Yeah, I thought it was remarkable how, like, in 5 minutes you switched from us being able to control things to us being completely controlled. And, I mean, I don't think anyone will object to being able to stop the DJ from playing awful music, but what about the other way around? Is it dangerous?
Right.
I mean,
No, it's totally dangerous. I mean, the thing is that because those networks are in play and because the services are being provisioned. And not to be sort of a fatalist about it, but the idea that these things are kind of active in the environment means that those are dynamics that have to be sorted out. I mean, I'm not, and I don't think I know what the answer is. I don't think anyone knows what the answer is in terms of who gets to decide any of this stuff, And so that's why building, sort of prototypes of these networks to sort of begin to understand who, how do you, come up with an ethics? I mean, again, civic society already has made these decisions, for itself without the technology. I mean, there is already a set of laws about who gets to make those decisions. So, just being able to understand what the technology does, toward reinforcing or eroding those decisions that civic society has already made is something that we need to start investigating before the systems start just popping up all over the place. Before you have, AirTunes that's hackable on the public square. So, but I think you're right. I mean, there is a huge tension. I mean, the city again. This is the thing I always have. Like technology in and of itself, communication technology. Not really the thing, if we want to get super paranoid about how encapsulated and control we are and under control we are, the city is already a technology for that in an incredible way. Like Manhattan is out of food in 24 hours if the trucks are not there. So forget about not having GPS. How about not having food tomorrow? It's like there is already an incredibly tenuous infrastructure that we're dependent on and could be used to control the people living inside of it. So, the idea that this is yet another layer of tenuous infrastructure that we'll be inhabiting, yeah, but it's already here. We're in the city. We have no idea where the water is. We have no idea where our food in the supermarket came from. It's like these systems are already encapsulating us. So, we can either go back to agrarianism or, accept them as things that we need to have a power relationship with.
Okay. Anybody else out there? Okay, well, maybe I'll dive in as well with a question. One of the speakers in one of the other sessions this morning was bringing up the issue that, of course, when you're looking at the city from the distance, you've got that utopian view. It's clean. You don't see the people and all that. And when you zoom in, down the ground, then you've got the dirty city. That's where the people are. So you've got the dichotomy between the urbanist and the social engineer. And also in a lot of your imagery, you're more on, let's say, that utopian, standing back bit. And I'm just be interested to know from your own personal interest and perspective, whether you're the social engineer down on the dirty level, or you're up on that macro urban design utopian level.
That's an interesting dichotomy: the social engineer or the utopianist. I don't know. Either of those sound like the best course of action, but I would say that part of what things like Flickr did is allow the people that had always stood back. I mean, if you're an OCD engineer sitting in Silicon Valley in some sort of rectilinear cubicle in an office park, you can now see what's happening in the slums in Dubai, slums in Mumbai, or the I guess, coming slums in Dubai.
That's
So, but you know, sort of the prospect of you know, actually bringing, you know, more experience in. I think this idea of, you know, the instrumented city and the idea of the sense of the city, it's actually harder to be in denial in this kind of utopian perspective, I guess, except about that sort of quantization I was talking about before. You can decide to ignore variables entirely, you know, and that's one of the things that sometimes modeling does in a very political sense, you know. So, you know, like GDP, for instance, you know, it's like, yes, it tells you how good your country is doing on a very specific, you know, set of quantifications. And so, you know, that if you're building a model of the city that is working in that way, then you're going to end up in some kind of utopianist abstraction. But if you're actually, you know, really, you know, sensing the city, then you're probably going to be down in it. Actually, you know, you won't be physically there, but you'll be psychologically there in a way that you probably couldn't have been if you were just sitting at your, you know, your latte third space in, you know, in the Bohopolis or wherever it is that, you know, the hipster part of town.
Okay. Anybody out there? Another question for Ben Cerveny? Okay, well, if not, then Ben, thank you very much.
Cheers.
Big round of applause, everybody, for Ben.